fiscally responsible, financial geniuses, monetary magicians. These are things people say about drivers who switch their car insurance to Progressive and save hundreds. Because Progressive offers discounts for paying in full, owning a home, and more. Plus, you can count on their great customer service to help when you need it, so your dollar goes a long way. Visit Progressive.com to see if you could save on car insurance. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Potential savings will vary. Not available in all states or situations.
This episode is brought to you by Peloton. Break through the busiest time of year with the brand new Peloton Cross Training Tread Plus. Powered by Peloton IQ. With real-time guidance and endless ways to move, you can personalize your workouts and train with confidence, helping you reach your goals in less time. Let yourself run, lift, sculpt, push, and go. Explore the new Peloton Cross Training Tread Plus at onepeloton.com.
Hi, Nat Doig here. Just a heads up that today's episode is a little different. And yes, I know, I say that every time, but this episode really is a little bit different. I'm going to be telling you a Cornish folk tale, and I will explore the history and some of the aspects of the story with you as well. But most of this episode is going to be taken up with me telling you this legend of Black Humphrey. Now, the legend is based on a Victorian version of the folk tale, which I came across in a newspaper. And so it is full of the larger-than-life characters you would expect in a Victorian folk tale. Also, possibly a larger-than-life accent from me. So I'd like to apologise up front to my Cornish friends and listeners for my terrible accent. I hope it doesn't detract from the wonderful story of the legend of Black Humphrey. Welcome to Weird in the Wade, a podcast about all that's weird, wonderful, and a little off kilter in the town of Biggleswade in Bedfordshire and its surrounding area. If you like your history with a pinch of the paranormal and your supernatural stories with some historical context, then this is the podcast for you. Whether it's the legend of Black Humphrey or Biggleswade's road ghosts. Grab a cuppa, sit back, and let me take you on a journey into the weird. It's the late 18th century, or thereabouts, and we're on the north coast of Cornwall, just north of Newquay, in the ancient port of Porth, or St Columporth. Porth is Cornish for port. This tale is no doubt old and has twisted and turned in the telling over many decades, even centuries. It is a story usually told by a salty old sea dog, you know the sort, smoking a pipe, confined to land by old age, whiskery and nostalgic. But as one of the main characters in this story is Jane Lissum, a young woman, I'm going to tell the story from the point of view of her best friend, a woman I have named Betsy Rundle. That was her name until she married one of those salty sea dogs who usually tells this tale, a sailor named William Trevelgue. But when our story starts, Betsy is young and courting William, but I'll let Betsy tell you her tale. We all knew no good would come of Edmund Humphrey since we were young'uns. He was the kind of lad who would skulk in the shadows, watching the rest of us work whilst being idle himself. And it wasn't as if he was rich. None of us were. He was just lazy and coddled by his mother, Agnes Humphrey. Her family lived up Morganporth way, in an old grey stone house in the crook of a dark and twisty lane. Agnes and her mother Nell before her were wise women, though many swore they were nearer the witch than the wise. When we were all about 10 maybe, Edmund Humphrey was knocked over by my dog Florrie on the beach. A complete accident. We all laughed. Edmund Humphrey fell arse over tit, as they say, into the water. His face, when my William went to help him up, twisted it was. His whole body shaking with humiliation. He had no words, which was unusual for Edmund. We braced for curses, but he slunk off to his mum and his grands in Morganporth without a word. Our Florrie, the sweetest hound you could ever meet, fell sick the next day. Although my mother and father denied it, us kids, we knew Black Humphrey's mother and grandmother had cast a spell on Florrie because of her son's embarrassment. Our Florrie survived, though she was never the same again. Maybe Edmund Humphrey didn't stand a chance to turn out well, considering his family. Rather than teach him to laugh at misfortune, they sought revenge. He didn't gain the moniker Black Humphrey until he was grown, though. And it wasn't so much because of his thick tangle of black curls and beard or his glimmering dark slate eyes, but the black mood that he was always to be found in. A man of more kindly and happy disposition with Black Humphrey's looks would have been called handsome, maybe, but not the scowling Edmund. He was, though, a fair good fisherman and sailor. It seemed that only on land was he idle. At sea, he was busy, boisterous and bossy. He safely navigated the trickiest of waters around Cornwall and all the way to the west coast of Ireland. He worked as part of a crew, but he longed to be captain. Now, Humphrey was the kind of man to quarrel when on land, and he did have rivals. His arch nemesis was a young man named Richard Petherick. I remember like it was yesterday, the day that Black Humphrey and Richard Petherick met. Although Richard's family were local, he had been sent away to school as a young'un. His dad was a fancy businessman in Newquay. Richard wasn't one of us, but at about age 18, once he'd left school and done a tour around Europe like the rich folks do, he returned to Cornwall. Then one day, Richard Petherick arrived in our village on a fancy little sailing boat. Oh, she was a dapper little thing, and Black Humphrey was keen to know who had just sailed into the harbour on her. Richard stepped onto dry land to quite the crowd of us. It was a clear spring day, and I remember the gulls were screeching. Now, the curious thing is that as Black Humphrey approached this newcomer, we all marvelled at how similar in looks they were, both with dark curls, grey eyes, and a strong build. They could have been brothers. Except Humphrey scowled, whilst Richard looked utterly delighted. He held out a hand to shake Humphrey's in pleasant greeting. We all held our breaths. Here clearly was a gent, and one who did not know Black Humphrey's reputation.
Good morning. I see you're admiring my...
Get out of my way!
Black Humphrey lurched past Richard, almost knocking him over, and skulked off to his own much more meagre fishing boat. Richard Petherick just shrugged and immediately turned his attention to the children running up to him and us maids wanting to know who he was. This must have infuriated Black Humphrey even more. The fact that his rudeness was so easily forgotten as Richard introduced himself to us all and let the children clamber onto his boat and look around. We later learnt that Richard was living in the big house on the hill, which quite literally looks over the village. I haven't told you about the village yet, have I? Well, it's the prettiest little place, in a valley between the St. Columns, that's major and minor. Our beach is narrower than some, but long, with huge iron-rich cliffs. Trevelgue juts out to the north, with its own island, reached by a creaky wooden bridge, and we call that Porth Island. On the headland are ancient earthworks and barrows. It can be quite the mysterious place. All along the beach are jagged rocks that jut out and form great cavernous caves. And the caves, they have fantastical names like Cathedral Cave, on account of church services and concerts being held there. And then there's the Banqueting Cave. That was used, yeah, you guessed it, for feasting. The huge Atlantic rollers crash onto our beach, and although you'd never guess it now, there was a proper port here in my day. Porth means port. Ships were built in the village. Some sailed all the way to America, but I'll come on to that in a bit. Back to Richard Petherick. He may have been out of my league, but my best friend Jane Lissum was the local beauty. She also came from a more refined background than me, having lived until she was 10 somewhere in the north, in England. She had long strawberry blonde hair and eyes the colour of rock pools on a sunny day. Her face, though freckled, was that of a porcelain doll. No matter how much hard work Jane did, nor how many pasties she ate, she remained petite and perfect. She could have had the pick of Cornwall, but she had her heart fixed on Richard Petherick. I settled for William Trevelgue, a humble fisherman, fond of his pipe, his cider, his dog and me, most probably in that order. Our story takes place after the building of the grandest ship yet in our village, the Heather Bell. It was about 7 years after Richard Petherick arrived. The Heather Bell's maiden voyage was to set sail all the way to New York with a cargo of tin and a ballast of china clay. 25 young men from the village were needed to crew her. There was much competition for who would captain her. The natural choice, an experienced captain named Peter Davy, was unable to helm the ship due to recovering from a broken leg. So he decreed that one of the experienced but young men of the village should be given this auspicious job. Black Humphrey naturally thought it should be him. He was an expert sailor, but Richard Petherick was also in contention, and he was not just a superb sailor, but also an inspiring leader. Davy made his decision, announcing it in the checkers at Trevelgue, what they now call Watergate Bay. The whole village was there, it felt like, to hear who would captain the Heather Bell. Davy began.
Edmund Humphrey, you may be the more skilled sailor, but Richard Petherick cannot be rivalled in clear-headedness, and he is loved by his crew, whilst you, Edmund, are feared. And so Richard Petherick will captain the Heather Bell.
Black Humphrey cursed.
Damn you all!
And he stormed off after this announcement was made. Most of us thought he'd slunk back to his mother's in that crooked house at Morganporth. He would have been offered a good position on that ship, but second best was never enough for Black Humphrey. The night before the Heather Bell was to set sail, Richard Petherick was walking along Trevelgue Head in the dusk. The gulls were gathering close to land, screaming their approach. The wind was low, and Richard was breathing in the scent of the marram grass, the thorn bushes, and earth rather than the sea. It was land he was spending time in before his long journey. My William was also out walking that night, and it is from him that we have this account. As Richard approached the line of twisted old thorn trees, Humphrey stepped out in front of him, blocking the path. Richard took a step back in alarm. He thought Humphrey was back in Morganporth.
You made me jump, Humphrey.
Aye, whilst you, Petherick, make me sick.
Richard sighed. He was tired of this rivalry that Humphrey stoked.
Well, you'll be glad that I'll be gone for some weeks then. Captain of the Heather Bell.
That should have been my ship. But never mind. As you say, you'll be away for some months. That gives me plenty of time to court and wed Jane Lissum in your absence.
Now, I'll give Richard his due. Although he did shout,
Jane Lissum is my girl.
He did then think on it, and of Jane, and added,
Though she should decide who her husband should be, not you nor I. But I know she will choose me, as we are already pledged.
Liar!
Roared Black Humphrey.
You bloody liar! She has not promised herself to you.
Richard's mouth twitched. His fists were clenched. The word liar was one he could not stomach. He was an honest man. Black Humphrey stomped forward. The gulls overhead screeched, diving down into the surf on the waves below Trevelgue Head.
You're a liar, Petherick!
As the cliff they stood on rumbled with the force of the waves crashing below, Richard acted without thought. He wound back his fist and knocked Black Humphrey down onto the hard, bare earth with a sickening thud. As Richard's hand began to throb, his stomach lurched and he winced at his own rashness. What had he done? Humphrey lay prone on the ground, not moving. The roar of the ocean in his ears, Richard felt lost in the fury of the moment. Humphrey wasn't moving. As Richard leant down over Humphrey's motionless body, a cold dread swept through him. Had he killed Humphrey? What felt like an age was just a matter of seconds, and Edmund Humphrey, who had been knocked out cold, came round, bleary and groggy, but mostly he was sore, angry and humiliated.
Here,
Richard said, proffering a hand to help Black Humphrey up. But Humphrey would have none of it.
I'm sorry. I did not intend to hit you so hard, Edmund. I promise.
He refused the hand of help and an apology. Humphrey just scowled. He was sitting upright at least, but he said no words.
Look, Jane will make her own mind up when I am back from the voyage. Then we can woo her fairly, and she can choose which one of us she prefers. Yes?
Richard looked down on the wretched Humphrey, but still got no response. Slowly, but purposefully, Edmund Humphrey got to his feet.
I will not accept an apology from you, Petherick. I seek only vengeance. You have stolen my captaincy, the woman I want, and now you have abused me. No more. I curse you, Petherick, and your voyage. I curse you all.
He turned and in the gloaming of dusk he slunk away up the steep hill to Morganporth and his mother and her witchy ways. Welcome to Weird in the Wade. I'm Nat Doig, and today I bring you an episode about a folk legend of the North Cornish coast, that of Black Humphrey, a character so infamous there is a rock named after him at Whipsiderry Beach. And yes, that has to be the best name for a beach ever, Whipsiderry. I'll tell you more about the location later. And yes, I am going to finish the story for you, because what happens to the Heather Bell as she makes her maiden voyage and returns home is the main part of the legend. I will, however, pause the story at certain points so we can explore the history and folklore behind it. Next time on Weird in the Wade, we will be back in Biggleswade exploring 2 cases of road ghosts. Very different cases, but fascinating just the same. So I hope you're happy to indulge me in this tale of smugglers and wreckers and ghosts in Cornwall. It's the place I moved to after leaving Bedfordshire age 11, and it's as much part of me as Biggleswade is, and shaped the stories I love and the history that fascinates me. When I recently went back to Newquay, I stayed at Porth, always one of my favourite beaches. On very lucky school days towards the end of term, we'd have PE lessons on the beach, which basically involved us just messing about and swimming in the sea. But as you'll learn in this episode, the history of both ancient and modern Porth and Whipsiderry is fascinating. But back to Porth and the maiden voyage of the Heather Bell. The morning the Heather Bell set sail, there was trouble at the dock. My William wasn't one of the crew. He was too skilled a fisherman to be spared for a jaunt like this. I stood with him and Jane at the quay watching the vessel slowly move off. Richard was waving his goodbye to Jane, and although he was troubled by what had occurred the night before with Humphrey, he was focused on the girl he loved until he wasn't. We all saw his face cloud and crumple into a scowl. At first, we had no idea why he looked so angry and afraid. It was my Bill who looked behind us, and in the throng, we saw Black Humphrey standing directly behind Jane. Humphrey's arm was not raised in a farewell wave like ours. No, his arm was raised in a fist. From where Richard stood on the ship, as it slowly drifted away from us, it would have appeared as if Black Humphrey's fist was directly above Jane's head, his pale, lascivious face just over her shoulder. My Bill punched Humphrey's arm hard, bringing it down. Bill was a superstitious man, and he did not want Richard's last view of land and the girl that he loved to be marred by Humphrey's antics. It would be terrible bad luck for the voyage. Humphrey threw a few threats Bill's way, but did not raise his fist again. Jane was quite tearful about Richard leaving and the antics of Humphrey. I comforted her the best I could, but she was a sensitive maid and just needed to cry it out of her system. Over the next few weeks, Black Humphrey made life tough for us all, slinking about the village, sniping threats at us as he passed. In the evening at the Mermaid Inn, Black Humphrey would sit by the fire and tell anyone who would listen that the Heather Bell was cursed. She was doomed, and that we'd not see the crew alive again. After one of those drunken rants in the pub, I decided to follow Humphrey when he left. Don't ask me why or how I screwed up the courage to do this, but I had heard rumours, and I wanted to see if there was truth in them. So by the light of the waning moon, I followed at some distance as Humphrey trudged the headland to Whipsiderry. It's the cove just to the north of Porth. The crash of the waves covered any sound my footsteps made. Once at Whipsiderry, Black Humphrey scuttled down those steep wooden steps like a crab. His black silhouette on the sand darted and disappeared into a cave. Now both Bill and I had heard rumours that Black Humphrey was casting spells from that rock which would later take his name. But we believed this was really subterfuge. We suspected that Edmund Humphrey was smuggling. He was storing contraband, rum, tobacco and tea in the caves at Whipsiderry, some of which had tunnels cut from them all the way to the tin mine. We thought that if he made us all think he was up to devilry on that rock, we'd avoid coming near his stash of illegal goods. After half an hour of sitting on the headland, and although sheltered by an old thorn from the worst of the wind, cold was creeping into my bones. I then saw Black Humphrey scuttle out of his cave and across the sand to the large black rock, a rugged sea stack once mined for iron in ancient times, left scarred and battered by human hand and the power of the Atlantic. I was now amazed to see him climb up that rugged rock. I guessed he must have some rope or some secret means of climbing, as it looked impossible, but he was like a spider as he skittered upwards. When he reached the top, he startled a group of gulls, who flapped away screaming their annoyance. They in turn startled some choughs who were roosting below me. I ducked down. The last thing I wanted was for Edmund Humphrey to see me watching him. When I dared raise my head, Black Humphrey's back was to me. He was staring out to sea from the top of that black rock. His arms were outstretched ahead of him. He seemed to be conducting an orchestra, as if he was bidding the waves to rush in and out to his timing. The moonlight cast him in a glittering silver shimmer, reflected in the surf. He seemed to glow. Now, Bill's dad had claimed that sailing past the rock one night, he had spied Humphrey atop it, and like this, had his arms outstretched, casting strange shapes and signs. Bill's dad also claimed that the night had been an exceptionally still and calm one, and he had heard Black Humphrey chanting. Not words in Cornish, nor English, just strange whooping sounds, like the language of the ocean creatures, like the seals or the Gannel Crake. Bill's dad, in older age, was now falling for flights of fancy. We dismissed what he said, but I supposed there must be truth in it. How else could I explain what I was seeing? Black Humphrey chanting, casting out spells into the wind, across the relentless seas. Curses, intentions, snagging in the tide and riding those currents out across to the Heather Bell, bringing doom to her crew. I shivered and quietly turned away, leaving Humphrey to his devilish work. It was 3 weeks later that we received word that the Heather Bell had made it to the west coast of Ireland. But the letter brought bitter news as well. Poor George Wetherill, one of the youngest crew members at just 18, had toppled from that boat into the ocean off the coast of Ireland, and he had drowned. Jane was heartbroken. She had looked after George as a tiny boy when she was but a young maid herself, the Wetherills and the Lissums being neighbours. I could not tell her that that very night George drowned, according to the letter, was the night I had witnessed Black Humphrey, like a skittering spider on that rock, casting webs of spells out into the night. Was Black Humphrey real? I paused the story for a moment to ask the question, was Black Humphrey real? This isn't the only legend of Black Humphrey. You can read in old guidebooks and tales of Cornwall differing accounts of a smuggler, wrecker and general wrongun named Black Humphrey. I know I've mentioned this in episodes before, but it's important to stress in pre-20th century times, denoting someone as black usually meant that they had dark hair and eyes. It didn't necessarily mean that they were a person of colour. Also, the moniker of black was given to people associated with wrongdoing and evil, or just those who were bad-tempered or depressed. We still use colour today to describe mood: blue for sadness, black moods for depression, jealousy is green. The association of black with badness and evil is problematic because the converse is then that white is good or pure. And these tropes have been used to fuel racism. And so it is important that I acknowledge that when I'm telling this story. Black Humphrey seems to have acquired his name in the way that pirates were known as Black or Bluebeard, because he had dark hair, but also because of his association with evil deeds. Some of the reports say that he was from Crantock, just south of Newquay. In these stories, his hideout was in the Crantock Caves, which were also said to have tunnels. He was linked to the Albion pub at Crantock, which dates back to the 1600s. But the rock named after him, Black Humphrey's Rock, is situated just north of Porth Beach at Whipsiderry, and even the tales which link him to Crantock also link him to that rock in Porth. They link him also to Porth and Morganporth, further up the coast. The story I have based this episode on was recounted as a ghost story for Christmas on the 25th of December 1889 in a Birmingham newspaper. A decade or so later, a New Zealander wrote a romance novel which features Black Humphrey as a villainous wrecker, pirate and smuggler. I'll look into the history of the wreckers later. I found in the birth and death records for the area around Newquay several contenders for an historical Black Humphrey. Edmund Humphrey, which is the name I took for the story, was a real man born in Crantock in 1725, but I found no death for him. There's also a Jacob Humphrey, born in 1705, with links to Morganporth. In fact, there's a whole family of 18th and 19th century Humphreys out Morgan Porth Way. Now, of course, his first name could have been Humphrey, not his last name. And there are a few Humphreys born at the right time, very close to Porth, including a Humphrey Davy, but not the inventor, who has the same name. I could not find any contemporary late 18th or early 19th century newspaper articles about a wrecker, smuggler or criminal with either the first or last name Humphrey in Cornwall who could fit this bill. So it's much later reports that we have to go on for evidence, some century after he was said to have lived. The earliest folk tales and anecdotes associated with him seem to date from the late 19th century, like the one I'm using as inspiration from 1889. Black Humphrey and his rock begin to be mentioned in guidebooks around the same time. In 1881, a piece in the Railway News prints a short verse it claims to be associated with this old rogue. When the wind is from the west, pray for me among the rest. When the wind is from the east, I'll to church as soon as priest. And the meaning of this was that when the wind was westerly, Humphrey would be out wrecking. But when the wind was easterly, there was no point, and so he'd be found in church. In January 1950, there is an interesting exchange of letters in the Newquay Express about whether Black Humphrey is real or not. A Miss Thora Muller, who the newspaper notes is the sister of the Reverend Muller, claims to have heard the story of Black Humphrey be told on many occasions and over many decades. She is convinced that he was a real person. She even gives a year of his death as 1804. Now, I could find no one to match to this death date with the name Humphrey. Thora also quotes that verse about the west and the east winds. The final word on the matter, though, at the end of January 1950, appears to be another letter that claims that there is no hard evidence that Black Humphrey was a real man. From my research, I would have to agree. There's no actual evidence like a court report or an 18th century newspaper article about a man named Humphrey committing crimes. But when we have a look at the records later, I think you'll see that it's likely probable that a man from the Newquay area, or maybe several men, inspired the legend of Black Humphrey. And making weird in the weight has taught me that when it comes to folklore and folk tales, there is usually a grain of truth right at the heart of the story. What is pretty certain, though, is that this ship, the Heather Bell, is fictional, as I cannot find any records of her existence as a Cornish-built ship. But during the 18th and 19th century, Porth was a busy port, importing and exporting goods, including tin, china clay and grain. But back to our story. Months passed, well over 3. We carried on as usual in the village. The rhythm of the tides, the seasons all crawled by unusually slowly. Humphrey had ceased his drunken mutterings in the pub and for about 2 months had been working out at Padstow, captaining a fishing vessel with some unsavoury characters. Good riddance, we all said. But November came and the Heather Bell was overdue her return. There had been no word from their arrival in New York. Letters could be sent on faster vessels, but this wasn't always the case. Also, in November, Black Humphrey slunk back to the village, suddenly flush with money. He bought some pretty ribbon and lace for Jane, but she refused the gifts. Humphrey just shrugged, which was unlike him. This made me suspicious, but Jane was just relieved. It was a mid-November night when the cry was heard. Bill and I were in the Mermaid eating supper. The Heather Bell had been spotted. She was heading back home. We ran along Trevelgue Head, over to Porth Island and watched. But something wasn't right. She was sailing in the wrong direction, sailing south away from us. Bill and the other men who were left in the village got into a boat and rowed out to sea towards her. Jane and I watched from Porth Island. The moonlight was strong. We saw Bill's boat approach the Heather Bell. We were full of hope, even though she was still facing away from us. Here is what Bill told me happened. As they approached the Heather Bell, they could see her crew, all at their posts. But they were all motionless. Nothing and no one on that ship was moving. The sails were stiff and perfectly still, and so were the people. The men were like stone. The ship itself was now moving in an impossible way, like an unseen force was pulling it towards us in Porth. It was being dragged through the waves, not sailing them. Jane and I saw this happen, this change in direction, this strange dragging movement, and I have never seen a boat move like it before or since. My stomach felt heavy and cold dread crept down my back. Meanwhile, Bill manoeuvred his little boat to follow the Heather Bell and try and get as close to her as possible. This he managed. He called out to the men on deck, to Richard Petherick, who we saw staring straight back at him. He yelled and yelled. There was no wind. The crew should hear him. The sea was like a mill pond, yet not a crew member of the Heather Bell flinched. None moved their heads in acknowledgement nor made any kind of sound. Of course, Jane and I could only see Bill's boat tag alongside the much greater ship, and we just hoped that the news was good, even if the Heather Bell was moving so strangely. And then, as can happen, though I have never seen it happen quite so fast and thick, a sea threat loomed up out of the ocean, and the Heather Bell and Bill's boat were swallowed in fog. Bill said to him it was like the fog had come from inside the Heather Bell herself, though he knew that could not be true. Enveloped in the mist, Bill's boat lost sight of the ship. Moments later, the fog began to clear in a patch where the Heather Bell had just been, but there was nothing. No Heather Bell, no crew, just dark waves crawling shoreward. Fog or no fog, the sea was so calm it was impossible for the Heather Bell to have vanished. She couldn't have sunk so fast, even if she was shattered to pieces or weighed down with all the rocks in the world. As you can imagine, we were all terrified and baffled by what Bill and his friends told us. The next day, a search was made all along the Newquay coast, all the way down to Portreath and up to Morganporth, just in case any part of the ship washed ashore. But no trace of her was found. The old men of the village talked of ghost ships, and the children whispered about how these ghost ships came in threes. On 3 consecutive nights they'd be seen. Old wives' tales. I'd heard them by the fireside as a young'un as well. Bill was staunch in his belief that the Heather Bell must have sunk. He could find no other rational explanation for it, and although he was a superstitious sailor, he was a rational man. Friday night. On the Friday night, after a day of fruitless searching for wreckage, the shout went up once more that the Heather Bell was seen, now sailing straight to us in Porth. Bill and his mates crewed a small boat, and as they clambered in, Black Humphrey was seen by the harbour wall. He laughed at them as they rowed off.
That's not the Heather Bell, you fools!
Again, Jane and I watched from Trevelgue Head. The moon was bright, and again the sea was unnaturally calm. I watched Bill's boat row out towards the ship, which was still a fair way off, and then, like the night before, up rolled a sudden sea threat, swallowing our view. We hurried back down to the quay and waited for Bill's return with an update. The Heather Bell would not attempt to land in such fog, surely. Jane was unusually calm, though, like the ocean around us. She claimed that she knew that Richard was safe. Even as we saw Bill return, Jane refused to come and speak with him. She sat on a rock and sang quietly to herself. She knitted as she sang, only breaking off from her song to scold us.
I tell you, that was not the Heather Bell. My Richard and her crew are safe. Not far from land, but that ship was not her. It's Humphrey's devilry. You are falling into his hands. That is not the Heather Bell. It is some glamour concocted by Black Humphrey. It merely looks like her. It is not Richard nor his ship.
I had not known Jane be so persuaded by witchcraft before, but I chose not to argue with her. She surprised me again later that night. Bill had told us that after reaching the side of the Heather Bell, she once more was consumed by fog, only for it to clear, and then she'd be missing. Now even the most steady-headed of us began to suspect that the Heather Bell was lost. We sat in the Mermaid by the fire, watching the flames flicker and fade. No one spoke, until Jane could bear it no longer, and she surprised me for the second time that night.
Richard is not dead. I will prove it to you.
How?
By the tried and tested way for when a ship is overdue. I will go to the shore. I will ask the sea for her secrets.
There was a sharp intake of breath by everyone in the Mermaid. This was indeed an ages-old belief, that the mother, daughter, wife, or sweetheart of a sailor could, when in dire need, ask the waves, the sea, for news of their loved one. you would only receive a reply if your loved one was dead. In the last century, publicly announcing such an endeavour may have led to an accusation of witchcraft. At the very least, you were attempting to commune with the dead. But in our more enlightened times, it was laughed at by the townsfolk. We on the coast knew that the sea was seldom wrong, but you paid a price to know such secrets. What that price was, no one could tell. Jane got up and marched out of the pub. I followed, as did an older woman of the village, Meg, who had lost a husband a decade ago to the sea. Meg strode up to Jane, placing her arm around Jane's shoulders and whispered in her ear. Then the three of us walked down the half-mile of sand to where the waves were breaking. No longer unnaturally calm, the waves were rolling in at a steady pace. The roar of the water filled our ears until we had to shout to one another to be heard. Meg indicated that we should stop. The moonlight glittered on the wet sand. Jane stepped forward. I watched her footprints sink and fill with seawater. With ripples now tugging at our feet, Jane began to shout.
Richard! I am waiting for you. I am here. I am listening. If your life has been taken by the sea, answer me. Answer me!
She called his name over and over again.
Richard! Richard! Richard!
Then Meg stepped forward, tugged on Jane's arm and pulled her back to where I stood, and we listened. All I could hear was the rushing of the water, the crashing of the waves and on the unseen rocks, the sucking of the sand as the sea rushed out. A group of wading birds piped eerily. There was no voice in answer to Jane's cries. After what felt like an hour but was just minutes, Meg spoke. Richard has not been taken by the sea maid. You'd know. We'd have heard. When my Sam was taken and I asked the waves, I heard his voice as clear as you're hearing mine now. He called to me. We heard nothing. Your Richard is safe.
For now.
Asking the sea. I'm going to pause the story here again to look at this practice of asking the sea when a sailor was overdue. I came across an account of it in a 1900 book called Highways and Byways of Devon and Cornwall by Arthur H. Norway. In the section for Newquay, he recounts a tale told to him by a local doctor, which I will read to you now. I was riding home in the dark one wintry evening when I saw a little group of people entering a solitary cottage by the roadside. The woman who passed in first was in tears. She was the tenant of the cottage and wife of a sailor whose ship was long overdue. Another woman who seemed to be trying to console her passed in with her. The third member of this party, an old fisherman with whom I have held many curious conversations, both before and since that evening, remained standing by the roadside. He greeted me as I dismounted. "Any fresh trouble here, Peter?" I asked. "Aye, sir," he replied, "for Jan's drowned." "Then you have heard that the ship is really lost?" "No, sir," was the reply. "Only poor Jan." "Is the ship safe, then?" "I don't know, sir, about the ship. Betty, she said she couldn't go on like this, waiting and not knowing whether her man is dead or alive. So she went and called on the shore, down by the water," he added, seeing that I did not understand him. "And then what happened? Did you go with her?" "Aye, sir," he answered in his slow way. "And Tamsin Rickard from Polmouth, and Betty. Her stood at the edge of the water, crying out, 'Oh, Jan, my man, good man.' Then Tamsin catches her by the arm and tells her to hush. And then, just very low, we heard an answer." The old man shook his head and stepped back to allow me to proceed. There was something in the manner so solemn and dignified as effectually to check my disposition to pry further. He had the aspect of one who had indeed been present at an actual communing with the dead. The widow called her husband. They all heard the spirit answer. So much might be told, but what remained was sacred to the bereaved woman's grief. I rode on after a few words of sympathy, and as I followed the coast road, beneath, the winter surges were beating heavily in the darkness, and I glanced out at a line of foam, across which the drowned sailor had answered the cry of his desolate wife. I began to wonder whether there might not be truth in some of the things, at least, across which we have long since drawn the bar of incredulity. When I read this, I just had to include it in the story of the Heather Bell and Black Humphrey and have Jane perform the same ritual. Growing up on the coast, I know the toll the sea takes on sailors and their families, and how terrible that was in the past. The churches you find dotted around the British coast are often heartbreaking, if peaceful chapels, which through memorials recount those lost at sea. But these were also places where wives, mothers, sisters and daughters would pray for the safe return of their loved ones. But what would you do? If you had no answer as to what had happened to your spouse or sweetheart, child or sibling, I think I'd be tempted to ask the sea if all else was silent on what had occurred. But back to the story after a few adverts. If you want ad-free episodes, why not join Weird in the Wade's Patreon, where you'll get access to ad-free episodes and bonus episodes also. Thank you for listening to the adverts.
When you want your spring break to feel like... and your kids' pool day to feel like... and your hotel bed to feel like... ooh, and room service to feel like... because at Hilton, hospitality feels like...
Your cabana's ready. Would you like fresh towels?
it matters where you stay. Book now at Hilton.com. Hilton, for the stay. This episode is brought to you by Nespresso. Introducing Virtuo Up, the latest in a long line of innovation from Nespresso. It's innovation you can touch, sense, and taste in every single cup. With a 3-second start, easy open lever, and dedicated brew over ice button, it's even easier to enjoy your coffee your way. Sip for yourself. Shop Virtuo Up exclusively at Nespresso.com. Spring is here, and there's a whole new way to chai at Starbucks that's made perfect for you. Choose your sweetness, dial it up, or keep things light. Add a touch of pistachio, a hint of strawberry, or vanilla, or make it a spring classic with lavender. Because this season, there's endless ways to chai at Starbucks.
Saturday dawned grey, and Bill again began a search of the coast for wreckage. He was certain this time that the Heather Bell must have sunk. As Jane predicted, though, nothing of the ship was found. We were determined to keep watch again that night. Everyone in the village was. Whether motivated by a belief that ghost ships appear in 3 consecutive nights, or like Jane, believing that the Heather Bell would make land soon. There was a fair crowd who walked up to Trevelgue Head that Saturday evening. I was working at the Mermaid that evening, although it was only the very old and frail who supped there that night. Everyone else was keeping vigil. We closed up early, and I decided to join Bill, Jane and the others on the island. I carried a horn lantern, though I knew every inch of Trevelgue Head like it was my own parlour. I needed no light. Unlike the previous 2 nights, there were clouds scudding across the sky. Occasionally, a flicker of moonlight would light up the sea and the beach to my side, only to be swallowed by more cloud in an instant. The wind was high. The distant waves were crashing. As I approached the row of thorn bushes that lead to the old barrow, I saw movement up ahead. I stepped back beside one of the twisty trees to let whoever it was approaching pass me. But whoever it was just stood still, as if they were waiting for me. I stepped back out and through the gap in the thorns where the path passes, and there in front of me, motionless, stood the hunched and dark shape of a man. "All right, mate?" I inquired. My lantern gave just a meagre light, but through it I could see whoever stood in front of me was sopping wet. His clothes were slick and shining, water dripped and pooled at his feet. Then one of those cold splinters of moonlight lit us. He raised his head as it did. Water was gushing from his mouth, his ears, his eyes, and his nose. His hair was plastered to his head. There was weed and rope wound about his body. But worst of all, I recognised his death-mottled face. It was that of George Wetherell, the lad drowned off the coast of Ireland, some 3 months before on the Heather Bell. I swallowed hard. I did not scream. I don't think I could have. It was as if all the air in my body was sucked out of me. All sound was dead in my ears. I couldn't even hear my racing heart. I stepped back unsteadily and away from this thing. And yet, a thought in the back of my mind beat like a drum. Don't let him see you be scared. It's just George. It's just little George Wetherell. And then the moon was shrouded in cloud once more and the shape of George Wetherell was gone. I very slowly and carefully walked to where he had stood, and there on the path was a deep puddle of water. I did not tread on it, but manoeuvred myself around it. When I arrived to where the villagers had thronged, there was some agitation. So my frightening encounter had to wait. The Heather Bell was seen once more. She was far off. I could not see her, but Bill and the others who passed around a telescope could. Like before, they dashed away to man the small boat used as a lifeboat and set out to sea to meet her. And I was in a quandary because I wanted to warn Bill about what I had seen, but he was gone in a flash. Jane, who I thought was with this group, was nowhere to be found. Old Meg was there and I asked her if she had seen Jane. Aye, she was here, but as soon as they spied the boat, she was gone. To the harbour? I asked. No, to Whipsiderry, Meg explained, pointing in the opposite direction to the quay. I was flummoxed. Finding Jane was now more urgent to me than the Heather Bell or my sighting of the ghost of George Wetherell or whatever it was. Why had she gone to Whipsiderry? I scrambled back over the headland past the old round barrow and to Whipsiderry. In another fleeting stream of moonlight, I saw below me 2 figures on that beach. One was undoubtedly Black Humphrey, and he was just at his rock and about to start his spidery ascent up it. Jane, meanwhile, was on the sand heading towards him. By the time I had descended the steep steps onto Whipsiderry beach, I could see neither of them. The tide was coming in apace, and where there had been shallow waves lapping at Black Humphrey's rock, now the waves rolled. Soon they would be crashing and boiling around that rock. I got as close as I could, and I called Jane's name. Eventually, in a lull in the wind, she called back.
Leave me be, Betsy! Leave me be!
I did not know what she was doing, but soon my vantage of her would disappear as I was pushed back towards the cliffs. So I rushed back up those cliff steps, and I dashed to the side of the bay, near that round barrow where I could look upon Black Humphrey's rock and see what Jane and Humphrey were up to. It soon became clear. At the ocean side of the rock, facing outwards, I could see a light, a beam, strong and straight, like a lighthouse. It was created by Black Humphrey placing a bright lantern in a cave mouth towards the top of the rock. Around the nearest side to me of Black Humphrey's rock, I saw a dark figure creep. The moonlight was gone, and I was not sure who it was for certain, but it had to be Jane. I then heard a shout from Trevelgue Head, where old Meg and the others stood watching for the Heather Bell's return. She was seeing close to now, though Bill's boat was not with her. She was sailing towards us, but too far to the north for Porth. Then I realised what was happening. The Heather Bell was sailing straight for Black Humphrey's rock. That beam of light, a wrecker's weapon. I knew in an instant what Jane was doing. It was her, definitely, that I had spied inching her way around that ledge to the cave where the lantern was placed. And sure enough, after what felt like an age, I saw the light dim and darken, and then something dark fell into the foaming waves below the rock. I cheered, though only I heard my cheer. Jane had done it. She had stopped Black Humphrey's plan. And then I saw him. A crab-like silhouette he was on the top of the rock where the gulls roosted in the marram grass. He was leaping up and down. I even caught what must have been his screams of rage. I waited to see Jane inch her way back the way she had come, but there was no sign of her. I then glanced out to see where the Heather Bell was sailing. And then I looked back and waited for Jane. I waited for the ship to turn course. I waited for Jane to appear. And the Heather Bell just continued her course straight to Black Humphrey's rock. Jane did not appear. Where was she? Why did the ship not turn? Then I saw Black Humphrey's silhouette dart forward, towards another shape, a smaller silhouette amongst the marram grass on the top of the rock. It was Jane. The Heather Bell was almost upon the rock now. Old Meg and the remaining villagers were screaming and wailing, many running towards where I stood. But my gaze was fixed on the 2 dark shapes on top of Black Humphrey's rock. They seemed to be wrestling with one another, yet it also looked as if they danced. A horrible, twisting, jerking dance. They got closer and closer to the edge of the rock. I could not tell who was pulling whom in that direction, but just as there was an almighty crack of wood on rock and waves crashing, the two dark figures fell. Rocks tumbled with them into the boiling sea below. This time I did scream, and my screams joined a cacophony of others. Sunday morning was piteously bright and freezing. The sun bleached the scene of devastation at Whipsiderry. On the Whipsiderry beach, shards of the Heather Bell's bow were strewn like giant splinters. Scattered as the tide had left them were the 24 crew members of the Heather Bell and Jane Lissum's lifeless body. It was the worst disaster to ever hit our small village, and I pray nothing even close ever happens again to any place. There was no sign of Black Humphrey's corpse. Some say it washed ashore at Morganporth, where his mother retrieved it and buried it in that overgrown garden of their dark cottage. Others say it washed into one of the caves on the rock which now bears his name, where it rotted and its skeleton still remains. Others say the sea took it and his soul is trapped and tormented at the bottom of the ocean for eternity. And some foolish maids and old men say he survived and moved to the south coast, to Foy or Falmouth, to continue his despicable ways. I hope you enjoyed my retelling of this story, and thank you for indulging me to spend time on a folk tale so far removed from Biggleswade and Bedfordshire. We may not be able to prove that Black Humphrey was an actual historical man, but the complicated history of shipwrecks, what caused them, and how the goods which washed ashore were salvaged certainly created his myth. In the 19th century, the question of wreckers and salvage rights was hotly contested and debated, and there were parliamentary commissions about them. So what was wrecking, and who were the wreckers? Wrecking has been popularised in books like Daphne du Maurier's Jamaica Inn and can mean very different things to different people. In Jamaica Inn, Joss Merlin and his gang are using lights to lure boats to crash on the treacherous rocks of the North Cornwall coast. They do this in order to plunder the cargo, caring naught for the lives that they've killed. But wrecking can also mean salvaging from shipwrecks in a more opportunistic way. There is a tale that I have come across in 19th century newspaper articles and in a fantastic doctoral thesis on wrecking. It's a tale about a clergyman who, during a Sunday service, hears of a wrecked ship and implored his congregation to not run down to the beach, but to wait until he could get down from his pulpit and derobe so they could all get a fair crack at the wreckage. Just about every Cornish coastal town claims this vicar as their own. What is clear is that Cornwall's coast has seen its fair share of shipwrecks. Areas experiencing the most shipwrecks between 1700 and 1865 were actually on the south coast, not the north coast of Cornwall. Mounts Bay experienced 243 and Land's End 236, whilst Falmouth experienced 121 shipwrecks. Whilst on the north coast, St Ives also had 121 wrecks, Padstow 196 and Newquay 67. These statistics are thanks to Catherine Pearce's thesis, So Barbarous a Practice, Cornish Wrecking, in which she explores the myths and realities of all aspects of wrecking. The vast majority of wreckers were opportunistic, and there were quite public disagreements about who had rights to what when it washed ashore. I even came across a Humphrey Williams, who entered such a disagreement with the Arundels, one of Cornwall's leading aristocratic families. This Humphrey Williams lived in the manor house at Carnanton, which is now on the very edge of Newquay Airport and RAF St Morgan. It's just a few miles to Porth, Whipsiderry and Watergate Bay. In 1826, Humphrey Williams was disputing over some wrecked timber which he had in safekeeping. Salvaged goods were supposed to be kept for a year and a day and then, if not claimed, could be owned by the finder. It seems Lord Arundel was after duty on the salvaged wood. I can't imagine that this dispute, carried out in polite English through excise officials, gentlemen and lawyers' letters, could have inspired Black Humphrey's legend. But it is curious that a man named Humphrey, who lived not far from Porth, was disputing his right to claim wreckage as his own. For a much greater insight into wrecking in Cornwall, do check out Catherine Pearce's thesis, which I will link to on the show blog, weirdinthewade.blog. The landscape today. The landscape at Porth has changed since the 18th and 19th centuries. Ships are no longer sailing in and out of Porth, and a road has been built to coast around the beach. Until 1902, you had to physically cross the beach and ford the river in order to make your journey north up the coast. Trevelgue Headland and Porth Island are still recognisable. The site of Bronze Age barrows and an important Iron Age settlement have shaped the land and islands and rocks off this coast. Iron was mined from the cliffs and rocks during the Iron Age period. An extensive archaeological excavation of Trevelgue Head at Porth Island in the 1930s revealed many Roman coins. These coins were dated before the Roman invasion of Britain, showing that these Cornish people traded with Rome. The excavation found out so much more as well about this Iron Age settlement. Black Humphrey's Rock was part of that settlement, and it was mined for iron. And this is partly why there are so many caves and tunnels in the rock and the cliffs around this part of the coast. Sadly, Whipsiderry, where you'll find Black Humphrey's Rock, is out of bounds. After a series of rockfalls and a dispute over development of the headland, access down those steep stairs to the beach has been closed. It's unclear if or when the cliffs at Whipsiderry will be made safe. You can still access the beach at very low tide, but the tides here are treacherous, and being trapped is a real possibility if you don't know the local waters and beaches. Although it is a real shame that Whipsiderry is currently out of bounds, there is something rather majestic about looking across to Black Humphrey's Rock on this deserted Whipsiderry beach. Something rather fitting for the rock named after a rogue that can no longer be easily approached, only admired from afar. A little like the nub of the truth in the folktale. We can only glimpse at it from afar, hidden amongst the stories as they have grown up over the years. Thank you. Thank you for listening to Weird in the Wade. Porth Beach has more stories to tell, including the tales of the Cathedral Cave, which 100 years ago concerts were held in regularly, and this involved dragging a piano across the beach. The fate of that cave is another story in itself, which I plan to tell in the future. And later this summer, I will bring you the tale of the Gannel Crake and other mythical beasts of Cornwall as well. I'd like to say a really big thank you to my voice actors this time. Ian Higton of Platform 32 YouTube channel for voicing Black Humphrey, Owen Staten from Time Between Times podcast as Richard Petherick, and Emily L. Watts as Jane Lissum. The Trevelgue Head crowd were played by Liz Barclay, Rhiannon Barrow, Bryan Bland, Olie Campbell, Steph Lay and Andy Skilton. Weird in the Wade is researched, written, presented and edited by me, Nat Doig. The theme music and the Sea theme were written and performed by Tess Savigere.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. I don't know if you knew this, but anyone can get the same premium wireless for $15 a month plan that I've been enjoying. It's not just for celebrities. So do like I did and have one of your assistants switch you to Mint Mobile today. I'm told it's super easy to do at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month plan, equivalent to $15 per month required. Intro rate first 3 months only, then full price plan options available. Taxes and fees extra. See full terms at mintmobile.com.
Want to see your brand on TV? Roku Ads Manager makes it easy to launch targeted ad campaigns in minutes, track results in real time, and drive on-screen purchases with just a click of the Roku remote. Get a $500 match on your first $500 spent with code ROKU500 at ads.roku.com. That's code ROKU500 at ads.roku.com. Terms apply.